To introduce our last speaker of the day, and then after his talk, I'll do some very brief closing remarks, and you guys can all head home for the day. Thank you again for coming. I hope you've had a wonderful time. I'm extremely pleased that we were able to have two amazing speakers, one to start our day with our keynote, being Carl Safina, who unfortunately did have to leave because he had to catch the ferry home to Long Island. But we're closing our day with another amazing speaker, and it is my privilege to introduce him now. So Scott Vernon Edwards is the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Organismal and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, and the Curator of Ornithology at Harvard's Associated Museum, the Museum of Comparative Zoology. When COVID-19 sent students home and halted lab research, Scott decided to fulfill his lifelong dream of cycling from the Atlantic to the Pacific. 2 weeks before his departure, nationwide protests broke out over the murder of George Floyd by a police officer. On the same day, a video of a racist encounter in Central Park involving a black birder and white woman went viral. As a result of that incident, a group of black birders and naturalists launched Black Birders Week, a social media campaign that elevates black voices in birding and takes on racism in the outdoors. Suddenly, Scott's adventure turned into a much larger mission. He created a Twitter account to participate in Black Birders Week and strapped Black Lives Matter signs to his bike. Along the way, Scott met up with fellow researchers as well as met many new people who cheered him on his quest. Please join me in welcoming Scott Edwards.
Thank you very much, Charles. This has been an extraordinary day. I think we need one more hand for Charles and the other organizers. And hopefully I can end the day with just some reflections and allow you to step back from what's been just an amazing set of talks. I've learned a lot, and I've met a lot of great people at this symposium. I'll just begin by saying that I'm also a scientist. The reason I say that is because I sometimes wonder if I'm better known for this crazy bike trip I took than for all the decades of science that I've done. And I'm also pleased to see 3 students from Harvard here who have been involved with the symposium. It's great to have them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I actually do for a living. And here's my lab group. We're in front of the Museum of Comparative Zoology. We're all interested in the evolution of birds. And although this is a conservation conference, there's a lot of important connections, obviously, between evolution and conservation. And the great thing about museums is that they're really important for teaching that next generation of scientists how to do science, about the diversity of birds. Much of the research that goes on there could be called basic curiosity-driven research, but I think you'll all agree that this is really important for inspiring folks to care for the planet, which is our main goal. Additionally, of course, we can learn a lot about the plight of birds and their history over time. For example, in some undergraduate work done a while ago, we were looking at, a student came to me and said, I want to know about the effect of heavy metals on seabird populations. And I sort of scratched my head, but it turned out that we had specimens going back over a century of this magnificent seabird, the black-footed albatross from Hawaii and Japan. And we went ahead and measured organic mercury in the feathers of these century-old specimens. And as you can see here, we found sobering evidence for increasing trend in organic mercury, sampling just a few feathers from each specimen. And so museum collections allow us to go back in time in ways that we couldn't otherwise do. A lot of my work involves measuring genetic diversity within populations, which of course is a really important part of conservation biology. And what you see here are measures of how much genetic variation there is in these 2 iconic species, the laysan and the black-footed albatross. And we've contrasted them with the amount of diversity seen in different birds of different conservation status. And so you can see data deficient here on the left in gray, least concern in green, nearly threatened, vulnerable, et cetera. And again, soberingly, you can see that these two albatross species, which are widespread in the Pacific Ocean, have fairly low levels of genetic diversity. And this is the kind of thing that can alert us to the potential need to establish new colonies to spread the genetic diversity around. Finally, a lot of the work we do is very curiosity-driven, sort of like, gee whiz, how did flightless birds lose their wings? And this is an incredible mix of information from the biogeography of these species, where they're found. We're looking at the genomes and the DNA of these species to see what's changing quickly in some species or not changing at all. And it's a really great synthesis of lots of the really cutting-edge tools that we see in modern biology. Now, in addition to research, of course, I'm very passionate about teaching. In fact, we're teaching ornithology right now. We've got 20 eager students. And it's a really great way to introduce students to the diversity of the world through birds. And we're very fortunate at Harvard. We're able to take field trips both locally and overseas. And I find that the museum is an excellent setting for this, because we can look at the structure of birds, learn about their movements and their locations through the collection, and the students really enjoy that as well. Now, being in a museum doesn't have its dark side. This individual, Louis Agassiz, my professorship is named after his son, which I think was a little more politically correct. But he was a swashbuckling Swiss scientist famous for his studies on glaciers. Sadly, he was a virulent racist, even in his own time. He was widely recognized as being a racist, and you may be familiar with a controversy involving some photographs of slaves that he had taken in the Peabody Museum. Really troubling legacy, trying to bolster his theories of human hierarchy. So we're dealing with that in lots of ways. You can see the chalkboard where he's teaching his invertebrates class here. When we move the collections out of their older position on the top of this old building that you saw earlier into the lower basement of a brand new, sparkling new facility, we actually exposed these chalkboards for the first time in about 150 years. And we couldn't resist having a little bit of fun to, I figured Agassiz would just be rolling in his grave. And I think it's very exciting to see diverse audiences beginning to enjoy birds, beginning to study birds. But there's lots more work we can do. So for example, William Brewster, who is a well-known ornithologist in New England, he helped found the American Ornithologists Union. He contributed a huge proportion of our collection. But perhaps what's less well known is that he had an African-American assistant named Robert Gilbert, who probably deserves more credit than he has gotten in terms of the numbers of specimens he put in the collection and the many wildlife photographs that he took very early on, a priceless record of some of our early birds and habitats. And so in a small token of gesture, we have renamed a room which was formerly named for Agassiz to the Robert Gilbert Room. Of course, this is in many ways window dressing, and really what we have to do, kind of like renaming the birds. Who out here is in favor of renaming the birds that have English names on them? Come on, let's get them up there. Don't worry, the sky will not fall when it happens. I mean, you hear all kinds of doomsday stories about, oh, we're not going to be able to birdwatch anymore if it's not true. And I do think it's like that. It's an important gesture, but I think the real work involves really making ornithology accessible to a wider audience and to get diverse populations involved, because that's what's going to sustain the field. It's not going to be sustainable to the extent that we keep certain groups out. Okay. On to the bicycle trip. Well, this was, imagine you're teaching ornithology. It's spring of 2020, March, and the deans and the head of your university say, you've got to go home, which was, really tragedy. There were tears all over. For those of you that teach, you know how difficult it was. And, teaching ornithology on Zoom in front of a screen is just, you can't really do it. I will say, we did meet for one last, almost tearful meeting, me and my class, and they had the option to stay back in their dorms for safety, but we all got together. It was really great to see everyone before we went off to our separate places. Anyway, once that class was done, I was just wondering, what am I going to do? I could either stay at home and wait for some administrator to send me another Zoom link for a meeting, or I could capitalize on a long-held dream I've had to cycle across the US. I had done some cycling as a college student, both in New England and over in Europe. And I knew what a great way it was to see a place and to see the people. And there are lots of areas of the United States that I've never been to and lots of communities that I've never been in touch with. And so I was a bit scared, no question about it. It's sort of like jumping off a diving board. You're not sure where you're going to fall. On the other hand, it's not as if I was going to the moon or anything. There are these things like cell phones, and you can really you can stay connected in ways that we just couldn't do decades ago. Anyway, here I am, sort of fresh as a baby on my first day. I was originally going to start from the West Coast because all the experts will tell you that west to east is easier. And they would be going on and on. You should really go west to east because the winds are going to be in your favor. And I said, have you done this trip before? And they're like, no, I haven't done it, but I know for a fact. No, look, let me tell you. My daughter actually had done an east to west trip just a couple years earlier, and she could do it. I could do it, darn it. But it was also, it just became logistically much more straightforward to drive the 45 minutes to Plum Island, one of my favorite spots on the planet, and move from there. And it was really nice to have my family there. We spent sort of most of the first day. They were sort of in tandem to my first site. You can see just some of the ways in which I did this. You've got front and back panniers. You've got a sleeping bag and a sleeping mat. You've got spare tires, lots of parts in those panniers. You've got about 3 days worth of food. You've got all kinds of rain gear and whatnot. And so it's like having a house on your bicycle. Now, as Charles mentioned, the trip did take on a bit of a political bent, but in many ways that was the myth that sort of built up around the trip as I was tweeting. I will unabashedly go on record saying I simply wanted to get out of the house. I did not have a mission larger than to see some great landscapes and maybe some new birds. But on the other hand, this was a great opportunity to fulfill a lifelong dream. And as I was tweeting, naturally, folks were interested in my story. And one of the early quips I had about the trip is that a bicycle trip is in some ways a good metaphor for a journey in science. You'll run into hills and roadblocks and flat tires, just don't let it stop you. And I think it's an apt metaphor. There's lots of challenges being a scientist, the least of which is getting funding for your work. But you can't let it stop you. You've got to figure out ways to make it happen. So here's an overview of my trip. You can see Plum Island there on the left, and then I ended up in Sunset Beach, Oregon on the right about 76 days later. It was a northern route going just under the Great Lakes there, cycling up through the Midwest and up into Montana. I used a lot of Google Maps at the beginning because there weren't any routes really established from Plum Island, but as soon as I got on some of the routes published by the Adventure Cycling Association, those were sort of my Bible. And I feel a bit like a Luddite, but I'm still a huge fan of paper maps. I think, hanging on to your phone, which was, in my case, was constantly running out of batteries, especially when I wanted to play music as I was writing, was simply dangerous. And so having the paper maps was really, really great. I probably camped about half the time. You can see that most of these campgrounds are just empty. I mean, this was COVID, of course. Now, on the weekends, in fact, the roads would get more crowded, campgrounds would get more crowded, and I'd usually have to call ahead a day just to make sure I had a place to stay. But it was, in fact, in many ways, a good time to hit the roads because I think there were fewer cars than there otherwise would have been. Here's an elevation profile of the trip starting from the right there. And the first sort of challenge, of course, were the southern Green Mountains of Vermont. And then I went down to the lowlands along the Erie Canal. I couldn't resist stopping by to see some friends at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the famed location. And that, of course, I could have spared myself a lot of uphills, though, because I had to go through the Allegheny Highlands to get to Ithaca. But then I went down again to the shores of Lake Erie. And then, of course, the long, imperceptibly, gradually uphill trip along the Midwest. Some of the first hills I encountered were in Badlands in the South Dakota. And then I hit the Black Hills, which is a really interesting outpost of the Rocky Mountains. The three big passes I crossed were all in Montana. I had a chance, as I'll tell you, to cross the Rockies in Wyoming. But the prospect of 9,000-foot pass, it sounds kind of romantic, but honestly, I had no interest in proving myself in that way. So I opted for the 6,000-foot passes up northward in Montana. Actually, some of the most challenging days for me were not in the Rockies, but in the Palouse of southeastern Washington, because not only do you have very steep grades, as you can see here, but you have searing heat by then, regularly going up above 100 degrees. Although the altitude is lower, the grades themselves are quite steep. So that was really challenging for me. And plus, you're sort of surrounded by this moonscape of mostly wheat fields and stuff. But anyway, it was. You can get a sense of how the waxes and wanes of the trip went. Now, birds, of course, were a big part of my journey. And I think one of the great things about being an ornithologist is that you automatically have a natural community. You might be cycling through places where you're not familiar. You might even be a little bit scared because you're not sure exactly where you are and you're not sure who you should ask a question to. But having this sort of portable community, even if it's common birds in these monocultures of agriculture, really gave me a sense of community. And it was just, I didn't spend a lot of time actually bird watching because, I think someone younger and more sprightly probably could have spent an hour each morning, but I wanted to make sure I got to the next night's place to sleep. And so, but I did, of course, do a lot of birding by ear, and this really was a lot of fun. One of the birds that I really got to know well, which I didn't know being in Massachusetts, was the upland sandpiper. Of course, we have some upland sandpipers here in New England, but they were much more common towards the Midwest. And it was a bird that I got to know over about a month of my journey. First, very surprised seeing this unknown species to me, but then gradually I learned its call and its habits. I love that wing beat. You can immediately see it looks like a big spotted sandpiper. So that was a really fun to get to know this species over time. Whoops, let's see here. It's thinking. Oh, it says PowerPoint is not responding. Close the program or restart the program. Let's see. I will wait for the program to respond. That's option 3. Let me see here. Maybe, there we go. Oh, there it is. It was just a big, okay. Oh, you can't actually see it. What I had done is I laid over the range of the upland sandpiper on this slide, and you could see that it's of course mostly in the Midwest, and I spent a good quarter of my journeys traveling through the core of its range. As I said, a lot of the birding I did was while I was traveling. You can hear the chipping sparrow there. You can hear the nighthawks coming on later. And it wasn't really until South Dakota where I started to see species that really told me I was making some headway. So for example, these western kingbirds here were one of the species that really told me, that must be I-90 or something in the background, but told me that I was actually making progress. And it was really that birdscape that really allowed me to see the progress I was making. This was the sort of the wall of mountains that I saw as I was entering Wyoming. Absolutely beautiful landscape, but not one that I wanted to cross. One route I could have taken would have taken me right over the Bighorn Mountains. And I imagined myself, cycling with trumpets blaring straight into Yellowstone National Park. But there was a small problem, and that was the 9,000-foot Powder Pass between me and it. And I just simply said, I don't want to do that. I was reading about the grades and whether I could do it. Of course, I probably could have done it, but call me a chicken. I went straight north up into Montana for lower passes. But that actually brought me to a whole series of new adventures that I wouldn't have had. One of the favorite aspects of the trip was getting to know some of the rivers. They were sort of like bookmarks occurring regularly. And we've seen some great talks here today about how human modification of the landscape has helped some species and not helped others. These cliff swallows, I'm sure, have benefited from all of the bridges, in this case, over the Missouri River. One of the coolest habitats that I ran into was the potholes. This in the Midwest. These, of course, are sort of marshy areas these days, sort of sandwiched in between big tracts of agriculture. So you can see things like black terns. You can see white-faced ibises. And it's really a miracle in many ways that many of these islands of diversity have persisted. You can see the soybeans there in the back. And so learning about new habitats, which I had never really seen before for myself, were really a wonderful aspect of the trip. It really emphasized to me the importance of our public lands. When I entered the Badlands National Park, it was as if I was in some sort of natural zoo. Suddenly all the prairie dogs and burrowing owls and antelopes and buffalo, they all sort of appeared as if you were crossing into a new world. And it really drove home how these sort of islands of biodiversity. There's also, it's probably thinking again. Many of the, let's see here. There we go. There we go. This is, again, the maps might not be showing, but these are just the examples of two species whose ranges I cycled through. One, of course, is the dickcissel, which we don't get much here in New England, but which I got to know really well. This is one of the species which I think is benefiting from all of that agriculture in the Midwest. This species, I probably spent a good 2 weeks riding through its range. By contrast, the California scrub jay has a very, very thin range going sort of towards the coast in Oregon and Washington and California. And I probably spent no more than 2 days going through its range. And so it's really fascinating to me how different species will pop in and drop out, presumably due to some subtle shift in the landscape. Some of these basic aspects of why species occur where they do are still mysteries to science. Now, one of the sobering aspects of my trip, of course, was all of the carnage that I encountered. And this, of course, is something that you have a much more of a front row seat on a bicycle than in the cars. You may know the statistics. I think it's something on the order of 200 million birds are sacrificed every year on our roads. And you know, I guess if I had one piece of advice, it would be to drive slower. Speed is often the difference between life and death for these birds. And just very, very sobering, lots of really iconic species. You know, I actually witnessed in several cases the actual impact of a car and a bird. I almost killed a bird myself. It was somewhere in Montana, and there were just cliff swallows all over the place, practically flying right through my wheels. But obviously, a car is going to be much more lethal to a bird. Now, as I mentioned, the rivers were these great punctuation marks, and one of the first big rivers I crossed was the Merrimack River. Little-known rivers to me, like the Illinois River, and of course the Great Mississippi and the Missouri. Out west, the rivers took on an even more historical vibe. The Little Bighorn River, where a major 19th century conflict between Native Americans and U.S. soldiers. The Yellowstone River, one of the key pathways that guided Lewis and Clark on their westward journey. The Clearwater River in Idaho, one of the best trout fishing in the country. And then the amazing Columbia River, just a really amazing diversity of different rivers. One of my favorite spots to camp was this site on the Yellowstone River. You can see I-90 in the background there. And I actually returned to this site just about 2 years later, in a car, of course. And it was remarkable, all the subtle things on the landscape that had changed. There was a new wind turbine. There were signs on roads that weren't there, unfortunately, when I was trying to find my way. But it's one of my favorite rivers. And in fact, as you might know, it's one of the longest undammed rivers in the lower 48, something on the order of 600 or 700 miles. The imprint of Native Americans on the land was, I think, even more evident on a bicycle. And you can see just some of the signs around. I learned things like the Meskwaki tribe is the only federally recognized Native American nation in the state of Iowa. And, you know, I saw sort of mixed reactions to Native American neighbors. When I was decided to head north out of Sheridan, Wyoming, towards Montana, I was cautioned, you know, don't go through the Crow Reservation, it's dangerous there. Now, like any community, the Crow Reservation has its challenges, but I can say with confidence that I met some of the most generous and outgoing people in that reservation. And so, you know, I think we all need to do our part to reach out to communities that we might not have encountered and may not know well enough. Lots of great evidence of Native American creativity. Sacagawea was a major presence in lots of different art forms all over my journey. Now, I also was able to stay with colleagues of mine in science, and that was also another great inspiration for me. So, for example, Sangeet Lamachini is a native of Nepal. He did a postdoctoral fellowship in my laboratory at Harvard. And, you know, through hard work and creativity, I mean, this guy had a CV that was just on fire. He got a great job at Kent State University. You can see his new community there on the right. It was so new that there wasn't even grass on the lawns, no trees. But at the same time, this was a huge accomplishment and something for which Sangeet was extremely proud. And so, you know, we are still looked at as the land of opportunity. And I think our communities benefit from the creativity of so many people coming to our shores. Now, I saw a lot of evidence for really thriving communities. Communities like Norwalk, Ohio, or Winona, Illinois. You see this amazing Lincoln-era schoolhouse, which was lovingly restored by this couple here. I'm telling you, if you ever want a grand welcome, go to Winona, Illinois. I went to the town green to pitch my tent, and a lady shows up giving me coupons for free ice cream and all kinds of stuff. I don't even know how she knew I was there. But it's really this work of energetic individuals that are keeping some communities thriving in some of these small towns. Now, on the other hand, there were a lot of evidence for decay and just downright economic hardship. Lots of closed stores, just rotting infrastructure. It's, a lot of the themes I saw out west were ones of changing technology. And the question is, can communities keep up with it? That was a really pressing question. I spent one night camped behind the bar, the pub in Arvada, Wyoming. And, the population was on the order of 80, I think. And I listened to a woman lamenting the transition away from coal. Now, why would she do that? Well, her family was a coal mining family. And she was experiencing firsthand how the market was moving away from her. And so it perhaps wasn't surprising that she was trying to convince me that renewable energy and wind turbines were a bad investment. Of course, I paused. I had never heard this before, but I knew that her reaction was coming more from fear and uncertainty than from any strong conviction. And so I think it's this sort of opportunity to listen to folks who are being buffeted by forces that we might never experience, which really gave me some insight. There were some incredible, just sort of moonscape-like landscapes. I mean, how surreal is this? Miles and miles of corn with wind turbines above it. And the scale, I would say, of the agricultural infrastructure is just staggering in this country. Moving around so many gigatons of grains and other agricultural products, it really, you realize that how much of our landscape is devoted to agriculture. Here I am sort of dwarfed by these massive, massive silos. Again, lots of evidence for aging infrastructure. And some very, I sort of was able to answer some questions which I had always had, like how do those cylindrical hay bales get made? You're talking to a city boy here. But there I was in Vivian, South Dakota, and there was my answer. I had never seen this before. Now, I was videotaping this farmer. He finally walked over to me. I thought he was going to punch me. But it turns out we had a really interesting conversation. Turns out this wasn't his land. He was just hired to put the hay bales together. And just all kinds of ways in which food is moved around. It's really stunning how much and how efficient the agricultural system is. One of the really unexpected surprises was Iowa. Iowa, as you may know, is the most managed state in the country. Probably 95% of the land is human influenced. And yet there were pockets that were very serene and full of interesting life. I heard barn owls. There were beautiful rivers. So it was a real pleasure to see these corners. There was a whole section of western Iowa called the Loess Hills. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. I had never heard of these amazing hills blown from sand coming over from Asia. It's a crazy, crazy phenomenon. Now, Lewis and Clark formed the backdrop for a lot of my journey in the western U.S. And in fact, I-90 pretty much, Lewis and Clark did that same route centuries ago. You can see Sacagawea, lots of interesting commemorative statues of her. Now, one of the real highlights for me was this Missouri Headwaters State Park, which in my book really should be a national park. This was the place where Jefferson had instructed Lewis and Clark to find the source of the Missouri River. Where did this river come from? I sort of naively expected that the source would be some little stream trickle up in the Rocky Mountains. Well, as many of you probably know, it's actually the confluence of three other rivers coming together, the Madison, the Gallatin, and the Jefferson. And so it's one of the most serene spots of my journey. And it's just one of these undiscovered gems that I was very fortunate to see. Now, as I moved further west, all these poignant signs, and I think one of the defining features, of course, of our country is our obsession with private land. Many of you are dealing with this as conservation scientists. How can we strike agreements with folks who might be possessing important biodiversity on their lands? And I just imagine sometimes how different my trip might have been had I undertaken it in, say, Scandinavia, where, as many of you know, land is basically in the public good. You can camp on someone else's land, provided you're not right in front of their doorstep. But I will tell you that only on one night did I sort of wing it, as it were, in terms of accommodation. I said, well, and in fact, it was in Illinois. You'd think there'd be places to stay. I was miles and miles from any hotel and miles from any campground. And so I asked a few people, would you mind if I pitched a tent in your yard? I won't go through all the details. It was a pretty troubling afternoon. Lots of people say, oh, it's much better a few miles down the road, and then not even be able to find a spot there. And so, and in fact, the low point, or a low point, came when a couple was sitting on their porch. Acres and acres of corn and lawn, perfect place to camp for the night. Now, as I rode up, I said, darn, I should have taken these Black Lives Matter signs off my bike. Ah, how stupid. Anyway, the die was cast. I asked them, can I camp in your yard? And they said, not with that sign on your bike. And so you can see how it's challenging, not just for a person of color, but for many kinds of people to move through communities that you might not be familiar with. And I think one of the things that makes not only a bicycle trip, but conservation challenging in this country is just how much of it is wrapped up in private land. Now, very early in my trip, this picture I think was taken on perhaps the second day. I was seeing all these signs, and as Charles mentioned, this trip began a mere week after George Floyd was murdered. And I remember in Nashua, New Hampshire, I think this was even the first day of the trip, a white woman holding a sign saying, "We've been silent too long." And at that point, I said, I've got to do something about this. I can't sort of go on this lark and not somehow participate in this much broader issue. And so I contacted a lady with whom I ended up staying, and within 24 hours, she put together these amazing signs. And Shutdown STEM was a day of reflection for the science, technology, engineering, and math community to sort of reflect on how they can improve access to science for diverse communities. And in many ways, this is really where my journey began in Schenectady, New York, with these signs, because they were kind of like a Rorschach's test. Some people would recoil from them, but others would embrace them. You get lots of honks on the horn or fists in the air. And there were times, as you can imagine, where I said to myself, it's silly to have these signs on your bike. You're not going to convince anyone in this particular community. Places, in my mind, like eastern Wyoming, northern Idaho, and I did actually take them down occasionally because I simply didn't feel safe doing it. Nonetheless, they were added a really nice, interesting dimension to the trip. Now, when I stopped by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I asked the director, John Fitzpatrick, I said, John, can you put together some signs that will really speak to the times? And he said, I'll see what I can come up with. Now, you probably know the Cornell Lab has this incredible marketing arm. It's amazing. And they gave me these two signs, and to be honest, I was a little underwhelmed. I said, come on, where's the fire here? But this one, Birds Spark Hope, I actually sort of strategically, I put that on the back of the bike. I figured it was not offensive, and anyone, angling to dislodge me from behind, wouldn't be offended. This one, the one on the right, I didn't put up very often, although by chance I happened to be crossing the Mississippi River on July 4th, and I said, well, this is certainly an appropriate sign for the diversity of opinions in our country. And now, naturally, you can imagine, I felt, frankly, a little silly sometimes carrying these signs around with no one around but the cows. And without meaning to, make light of the movement, I took this photo and this tweet. It was really cool. These cows, they basically stampeded. You could feel the earth shake. And but then they came back. They were curious. I could tell they were curious. Now, by the time I got to Oregon, and you probably remember, that's where a lot of the mayhem erupted. That's where all the anger and the rage erupted. You could see it all over the place. And, I think if I learned anything, and it's a lesson that many of you probably know already, is that the real divisions in this country are not Democratic and Republican. I see them more as rural and urban. Like clockwork, the landscape of political signs would change as one moved from rural to urban, such as you see heading into Iowa City there, or vice versa. And so that's a challenge, I would say. And how do we come together as a people to see common ground? As you can see, my journey was traveling through, and in fact, most of rural America is predominantly white. Despite the remarkable movements taken part in the Great Migration of the Southern blacks, the vast majority of blacks still live in the Southeast. And so many of the communities I was traveling through were homogeneous in a way that many communities in the Northeast are not. One of the great joys of teaching at Harvard is the incredible diversity of the students. And I think it's learning how to connect with and to not be afraid of folks that are different from us that I think is a really important goal. But the problem is it's hard to do that when your community is not itself diverse. And so I think that's a real challenge in many rural communities. Now, the people that I met were, to a person, extremely generous and kind. I didn't always agree with their political views. This man in Iroquois, Illinois, tried to convince me that the Black Lives Matter movement was funded by the Democratic Party. Lenny here, who is a waste management worker in Roosevelt, Washington, he was, I asked him, he was kind enough to give me a shower, and I actually saw how it was that these truckers, live when they're not driving around. They have a beautiful stainless steel facility and great changing rooms and whatnot. And I asked him, how do you survive in this part of Washington State, very, very conservative? And he sort of looked at me and said, oh, I know how to survive here. He was clearly a veteran, but he was born in Walla Walla, and he had made his living in Southeast Washington. Wyola, Montana, I met these two gentlemen here, one of whom was a member of the Crow tribe on the right. And, for him, the highlights of his life was when he went to Denver to see the Eagles in concert. And I realized, hey, I like that band too. We have lots in common, and I think the more we connect, the more we can see how much we actually have in common. This couple here was actually where I finally landed on that terrible evening in Illinois when I couldn't find a place to stay. They lived in a small town, but they had worked in inner city Chicago and had worked with black youth and had realized the challenges of many kinds of communities. And so they were not fazed by these signs on my bike. They took me in and were one of the most generous couples I met. The couple on the far right, the lower right there, also very generous, living in the suburbs of Portland, their store had been looted and trashed by the protesters of Black Lives Matter. Now you can imagine how that might color their opinion of the movement. So lots of different prisms through which to see this, tumultuous time in our country. Now, when I turned a corner in eastern Washington and saw this remarkable ice cream cone of a mountain, my heart really quickened because I knew I was getting close to the coast. And as it came into view, it was just one of the most beautiful sights, transitioning from the dry scablands of eastern Washington to the coniferous forests of the Pacific Northwest. Lots of great questions for ornithological study. I'll tell you, I think the brown creepers out west they look twice as big as the ones here in the east, so I've got to follow up on that. One of the highlights for me was this 99-mile downhill. Once I had covered that last pass in Montana, going through Highway 12 in northern Idaho, really a beautiful stretch. I got lots of good advice on the trip, some of the best of which was to eat well. Don't focus on the endpoint. This is something I tell my graduate students who are trying to get a PhD. Don't focus on the PhD. Just get to the next step. And to enjoy yourself. You might think that trying to house and feed and clean a one-person bike journeyer would be a straightforward task, but some days I felt as if I was managing a corporation, honestly. But it was a really wonderful opportunity, and I think it gave me a little bit more understanding of some of the amazing places and birds and people of our great country. And so I'll just leave you with some of the books. I'm hoping to write a book as well, like Carl Safina has, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.